It was one of those evenings where the city seemed to hum with luxury, the kind of place where every table was polished to a mirror shine and every waiter carried themselves with quiet precision. The restaurant sat in the heart of downtown, known for its exclusivity and clientele made up of CEOs, foreign investors, and people whose lives were built on wealth and influence. Among them, one man stood out, a millionaire known not only for his fortune but for his arrogance. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his watch gleaming under the dim lights, he exuded the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. That evening, he was entertaining a group of business partners from overseas, laughing loudly, dominating every conversation, and treating those around him like mere accessories to his importance. When the waitress approached his table, the atmosphere subtly shifted. She was young, graceful, and composed, with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the noise of the table. Her name tag read Aliyah, and despite the commotion around her, she moved with quiet efficiency. She greeted the guests politely, took their drink orders, and maintained her professional smile, even as the men barely acknowledged her presence. The millionaire glanced up, smirking slightly as his gaze lingered longer than it should have. Something about her poise irked him, perhaps the confidence in her tone or the lack of flattery in her demeanor. He wasn't used to people who didn't try to impress him. As she turned to walk away, he called out to her again, this time in a mocking tone. "Hey, sweetheart," he said loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "You think you could serve us in Chinese? I'll give you 100 grand if you can do that." His friends chuckled, some awkwardly, others joining in the mockery. The air grew tense, not because of the money, but because everyone understood what he was really implying. It wasn't a test of skill. It was an insult wrapped in arrogance, a challenge meant to humiliate. The way he emphasized Chinese carried a tone of disbelief, as though someone like her, a young black waitress, could never possibly know such a language. Aliyah paused for a brief moment. She could feel the weight of the stares on her, the judgmental amusement from his table, the subtle curiosity from nearby diners. Her heart pounded, but her expression didn't falter. She turned back toward him, the faintest trace of a smile appearing at the corner of her lips. "Did you say Chinese, sir?" she asked politely, her voice calm but firm. He leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Yeah, Chinese. You know, Mandarin, Cantonese, whatever they speak over there. If you can take our order and serve us in that, I'll write you a check right now. $100,000. His words dripped with mockery, and his companions burst into laughter. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Aliyah looked him straight in the eyes, her expression unreadable. "Very well, sir," she replied softly, and then without hesitation she began speaking, fluent, articulate, and confident, in Mandarin. Her pronunciation was precise, her tone natural, her cadence perfect. The men froze mid-laughter, their grins slowly fading as the sound of her voice filled the air. Aliyah's words flowed effortlessly, asking them how they preferred their wine, confirming the type of cuisine they'd ordered, switching between formal and conversational phrases with the ease of someone who had lived the language, not merely studied it. Around the room, conversations quieted as people turned to watch. Even those unfamiliar with the language could tell by the expressions on the faces of the foreign guests at the table. They were astonished, nodding with impressed smiles, replying to her in Mandarin themselves. The millionaire's smugness evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. He stared at her, his jaw slightly open, trying to process what was happening. He had expected a flustered response, a laugh, maybe even an apology. But instead, he was confronted with the undeniable grace of intellect and composure. When she finished taking their order, she switched seamlessly into Cantonese, addressing one of the guests who had spoken to her in a different dialect. The man laughed in delight, clearly impressed. She even added a few words in another Chinese dialect, her tone warm and conversational. It was as if she had unlocked a hidden part of herself in that moment. Not for approval, not for validation, but to assert quiet dignity in the face of mockery. The room was silent for several seconds before a few people began to clap softly. unable to contain their admiration. The millionaire sat back, visibly uncomfortable, his earlier confidence replaced by something unfamiliar: humility. His business partners looked at him with a mix of surprise and disapproval, clearly recognizing the impropriety of his earlier comment. Aliyah, however, didn't linger for his reaction. She simply nodded politely and walked away, her posture straight, her face serene. Every step she took carried the power of someone who had just dismantled prejudice without raising her voice or losing her composure. At the bar, one of her co-workers whispered, "Aliyah." What was that? "Since when do you speak Chinese?" She smiled faintly. "Since college," she said quietly. "I studied linguistics. Spent a few years abroad. I guess tonight was the first time it really came in handy?" Her co-worker shook her head, still amazed. "You just shut that guy down in front of everyone." Aliyah didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence that followed her demonstration had already said more than words could. Back at the table, the millionaire's friends were whispering amongst themselves. The man who had made the challenge looked uneasy, glancing occasionally in Aliyah's direction. His arrogance had been replaced by something else, perhaps embarrassment or even regret. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound rang hollow. For the first time in a long while, he was not the center of attention. The people around him were no longer impressed by his wealth, but by the effortless brilliance of the person he had tried to belittle. The rest of the dinner continued quietly. Every so often, the millionaire would steal glances at Aliyah as she moved gracefully through the restaurant, helping other guests, her professionalism unwavering. In that moment, he realized something he'd never considered before: that intelligence, respect, and class couldn't be bought, and that the world was full of people who carried stories far deeper than what met the eye. He had tried to measure worth through money, but she had reminded him that dignity speaks a language all its own. The moment the room fell silent after her flawless response in Mandarin, the air seemed charged with disbelief. Aliyah stood calmly beside the millionaire's table, the confidence in her tone unshaken, her expression neutral yet subtly powerful. For the guests who understood the language, her fluency was undeniable. For those who didn't, the flow, rhythm, and ease with which she spoke told them everything they needed to know. What had started as a cruel attempt to humiliate her had turned into an unexpected display of brilliance that left the arrogant businessman visibly unsettled. But what no one in that room knew was the story behind that calm composure, the years of effort, sacrifice, and experience that had shaped the young waitress standing before them. Aliyah wasn't just someone who had picked up a few phrases here and there. She was a linguistics graduate, top of her class, who had spent years studying not only the mechanics of language, but also the art of cultural connection. Her fascination with languages began when she was just a child growing up in a modest neighborhood where diversity was part of daily life. Her mother worked as a librarian, and her father, a musician, often hosted gatherings where people from different backgrounds would come together. As a child, Aliyah would listen to them speak in Spanish, Arabic, French, and Creole, absorbing the music of their words even before she understood their meanings. She realized early on that language wasn't just communication, it was power. It was a bridge between worlds that most people never tried to cross. When she entered university, she chose linguistics not because it was easy, but because it was challenging. She thrived on understanding the nuances between tones, dialects, and syntax. She could lose herself for hours in phonetic transcriptions, her notebooks filled with strange symbols and characters that represented the sounds of the world. During her junior year, she earned a scholarship to study abroad in China, an opportunity that would change her life entirely. For 2 years, she lived in Beijing, teaching English part-time and immersing herself completely in the language and culture. The first months were difficult. She faced stares, skepticism, and cultural barriers. But her determination outlasted every doubt. Every morning before sunrise, she would walk through the narrow streets of her neighborhood, practicing tones with elderly locals who became her mentors and friends. They admired her persistence, her humility, and her genuine interest in their way of life. She learned not only Mandarin but also picked up Cantonese during visits to southern provinces, driven by a desire to understand how dialects connected and diverged. By the time she returned home, she could switch between languages with a fluency that stunned even her professors. Her thesis on cross-cultural communication won departmental recognition, and she graduated with honors, already receiving offers to work as a translator and language consultant. But life had other plans. When her mother fell ill shortly after her graduation, Aliyah set aside her ambitions to care for her. She took a job at the restaurant to pay for medical expenses, always promising herself that this was temporary. Yet even in that setting, she carried her pride and education with quiet grace. She knew that serving tables didn't define her. It was simply a chapter, not the whole book. So when the millionaire had mocked her that night, assuming she was uneducated and beneath him, he had unknowingly provoked a woman whose depth reached far beyond his comprehension. As she continued her shift after the encounter, her mind briefly drifted back to those years in China. She remembered standing at the Great Wall on a misty morning, watching the horizon stretch endlessly, feeling small but limitless at the same time. She remembered the laughter of the children she tutored, the kindness of strangers who helped her find her way in a new land, the professors who encouraged her to chase mastery instead of mediocrity. Every memory became a thread woven into who she was, a mosaic of resilience and intellect that no amount of money or mockery could diminish. When she spoke to the guests at the table in their native dialects, she wasn't just responding to a challenge, she was reclaiming dignity for every person who had ever been underestimated because of their background, appearance, or occupation. Her voice, steady and melodic, carried the weight of that unspoken message. The businessman's partners recognized it too. One of them, a Chinese investor, smiled warmly and complimented her in Mandarin, calling her Yu Shijian de Ren, meaning a person of substance. Aliyah bowed slightly, responding humbly, her composure flawless. The millionaire, meanwhile, sat still, replaying the scene in his mind. He had come into the restaurant assuming his wealth gave him power over everyone he encountered, but in that moment, his money felt meaningless. The sharp contrast between his arrogance and her elegance exposed something uncomfortable within him. A realization that knowledge, culture, and grace were forms of wealth he could never buy. His laughter earlier had drawn attention, but now, so did his silence. As Aliyah walked back toward the kitchen, she caught fragments of whispers from nearby tables. Some guests were expressing admiration. Others were quietly embarrassed that they had laughed along with the millionaire moments before. Even her fellow staff members watched her differently now, not just as a colleague, but as someone extraordinary hiding in plain sight. Yet Aliyah didn't let it change her demeanor. She continued her work as she always did, polite, attentive, and calm, her focus never wavering. Later that night, as the restaurant began to close, the Chinese investor approached her privately. He thanked her again for her fluency and asked where she had learned to speak so naturally. When she told him about her background in linguistics, his eyes lit up with recognition. "You're wasted here," he said kindly. "People like you should be teaching, consulting, building bridges between cultures." She smiled modestly, her eyes soft with gratitude, but also humility. She had heard such words before, but circumstances had a way of reshaping dreams. Still, his words reignited something inside her. The reminder that her talents were not forgotten, only waiting for the right moment to rise again. As she gathered her things at the end of the night, Aliyah looked around the empty restaurant, her reflection faintly visible in the window. She thought about how life often hides extraordinary stories behind ordinary roles. How the world so easily labels people based on what they see in front of them, never realizing the complexity that lies beneath. She wasn't angry at the millionaire. She pitied him. His ignorance had given her a platform to reveal the truth, not just about herself, but about human potential. Every person has layers unseen, capabilities untapped, and histories untold. In the quiet hum of the restaurant after hours, she whispered a few words in Chinese to herself, not as a performance, but as a reminder of who she was and what she had achieved. Her journey had been long, filled with challenges and sacrifices, but it had also given her something priceless, a strength rooted in knowledge and compassion. And though she wore a waitress's apron now, her heart carried the weight of 9 languages and the confidence of someone who had mastered them all with grace and purpose. The restaurant was still buzzing faintly when Aliyah returned to the millionaire's table with their orders. The tension that once filled the air had dissolved into an uneasy silence, and for the first time all evening, the man who had mocked her avoided meeting her eyes. His laughter was gone, replaced by a stiffness that betrayed discomfort. The guests he'd been entertaining, men who had earlier chuckled along with his arrogance, now regarded him with quiet disapproval. One of them even gave Aliyah a small nod of respect, acknowledging her not just as a waitress, but as someone who had just changed the tone of the entire evening without raising her voice or seeking revenge. Aliyah moved with the same composure she'd always had, placing each dish carefully, making sure every guest was served perfectly. She said nothing unnecessary, yet her silence carried weight. Each movement seemed to remind everyone at that table of what had just happened, that their assumptions had been shattered by the very person they had dismissed. The millionaire sat in a strange kind of stillness, his earlier arrogance replaced by a reluctant respect that he didn't quite know how to express. His world, built on control and status, had been disrupted by something as simple and profound as humility wrapped in brilliance. When she finished setting down the dishes, Aliyah stepped back and asked in English if they needed anything else. Her tone was polite but distant, professional yet firm, making it clear that she had reclaimed the balance of power without ever breaking decorum. The man looked up at her and after a long pause muttered, "No, thank you." His voice lacked the confidence it once had. It carried traces of shame, a realization that no amount of money could undo what he had revealed about himself. The rest of the restaurant had quietly moved on, yet the story of what had happened traveled from table to table like a whispered tale. The staff exchanged knowing glances, and a few guests spoke softly about the moment they had just witnessed. It wasn't often that arrogance met its equal in grace, and even rarer that it was defeated by it so effortlessly. Aliyah, however, didn't dwell on the attention. For her, it wasn't about proving herself. It was about standing firm in the face of disrespect and reminding others that worth was not determined by appearances. The millionaire's business associates tried to steer the conversation back to casual topics, but the energy had shifted. He responded mechanically, his usual charisma replaced by forced laughter. The Chinese investor among them occasionally glanced at Aliyah as she passed by, smiling with genuine appreciation. He knew the courage it took to respond to humiliation with intelligence rather than anger. When the meal ended and the check arrived, the millionaire hesitated for a moment before signing. He glanced at Aliyah, the words of his earlier challenge replaying in his mind, echoing with bitter irony. $100,000 had been his joke, but now he felt the real cost of that arrogance. He stood up, straightening his jacket, and approached her at the counter where she was entering orders into the system. "Miss," he began quietly, his tone softened. "About earlier, He stopped, struggling to find the right words. She turned toward him calmly, her eyes steady. "There's no need to explain, sir," she said gently. "People say things they don't always mean." But her calmness only deepened his discomfort. "Still," he insisted, "I was out of line. You're clearly very talented." The apology was clumsy but sincere enough to carry weight. Aliyah nodded, offering him a small, understanding smile. "Thank you," she replied. "Enjoy your evening." And just like that, she returned to her work, leaving him standing there, unsure of what to do next. He lingered for a moment longer before walking out of the restaurant, his companions following behind. On the sidewalk, the cool night air hit him like a reset. For the first time in a long time, he felt small, not because of humiliation, but because of realization. His wealth had insulated him from humility, from seeing people for who they truly were. In that brief encounter, Aliyah had shown him what real intelligence and dignity looked like, something he'd spent his whole life trying to buy, but had never earned. Inside, Aliyah finally exhaled. The rush of adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation began to fade, replaced by quiet relief. Her co-workers gathered around her, smiling and shaking their heads in disbelief. "Girl," one of them whispered, "I've never seen anyone shut someone down like that before." Another added, "You should have seen his face when you started speaking. I swear he turned pale." Aaliyah laughed softly, shaking her head. "I didn't do it to shut him down," she said. "I just wanted to remind him, and maybe everyone else, that we're not what people assume we are." That night, as she left the restaurant and walked toward the bus stop, the city lights shimmered across the wet pavement. Her reflection followed her in the puddles, strong, composed, and unbothered. She thought about her journey, the winding path that had brought her here. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it had built her into someone unshakable. She had seen the world, faced prejudice in multiple countries, and learned that respect was never freely given. It was claimed through quiet confidence and unwavering integrity. As she waited for the bus, her phone buzzed with a message from an old university friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. It was as if the universe had chosen that exact moment to remind her of where she came from. Her friend had sent a photo of their graduation day, the two of them in caps and gowns, smiling against the bright spring sky. Underneath was a simple message. "You still inspire me." Aaliyah smiled, her eyes softening. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel proud, not for proving anyone wrong, but for staying true to herself. The next morning, the restaurant's manager called her into the office. He looked uneasy but impressed. "I heard what happened last night," he said. "A few guests even called this morning to compliment you. One of them was that Chinese investor. He left his card and said he wants to speak to you about an opportunity." Aaliyah blinked in surprise, accepting the card quietly. The name on it was familiar. He was the head of a multinational firm that specialized in international communication and translation services. She slipped the card into her pocket, her heart quietly racing. Life, she realized, had an uncanny way of opening doors when you least expected it. That evening, she sat by her window with a cup of tea, replaying the entire day in her mind. Outside, the city buzzed with noise, but inside, everything was calm. She reflected on how a single act of disrespect had turned into a moment of empowerment, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed it. It wasn't revenge that had satisfied her. It was the knowledge that she had made someone confront their own ignorance. She had done it not with anger, but with mastery. That was her victory. Somewhere across the city, the millionaire was also reflecting. The event from the previous night refused to leave his thoughts. He had built his identity around power and money, yet one waitress had managed to expose how fragile that identity truly was. He realized he hadn't just embarrassed himself. He had learned something essential, that the people he overlooked often carried stories of resilience far greater than his own. He made a silent vow to remember that moment, to treat people differently, to recognize that respect was not earned by wealth, but by humility. In the weeks that followed, Aaliyah's life began to change in quiet but profound ways. The Chinese investor kept his promise and offered her a position with his company. It was an opportunity to return to what she loved, to teach, to translate, to travel again. As she packed up her small apartment, preparing to step into the next chapter of her life, she thought back to that night at the restaurant. The millionaire's challenge had not humiliated her. It had reminded her of her worth. She had met prejudice with poise, ignorance with intellect, and mockery with mastery. And though the world might still judge at first glance, she knew something far greater, that true dignity never needed to shout to be heard.